Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're pulling right back the curtain to uncover the absolute highest level of corporate maneuvering. We constantly hear about trade wars, global supply chains, and all these complex economic policies, but it is incredibly rare that we get to see the precise, calculated moves a single company can make to just completely insulate itself from a global financial storm. We're looking at this really extraordinary case study where immense corporate power basically met government policy and one single CEO managed to carve out a path that completely baffled the rest of the market. Let's get right into the data and see exactly how this whole thing unfolded. Okay, let's dive into this massive looming threat, a 25% tariff. In the world of global manufacturing, where profit margins are already razor thin, a sudden 25% penalty isn't just a minor speed bump, right? It's an absolute economic earthquake. This was the penalty being threatened across the board, just a massive tax on imported goods that stood to totally crush competitors relying on overseas assembly. For most companies, dealing with a tariff of this size means you either eat the cost and destroy your profits, or you pass it on to the consumer and absolutely tank your sales volume. It was a literal industry-wide panic, and pretty much every major player was bracing for a devastating hit.
And to put that into perspective, this is exactly what that 25% penalty translates to out in the real world: $3,500. According to our source material, this was the potential skyrocketing price tag of an iPhone if those tariffs were actually applied to Apple's supply chain. Just imagine walking into a store to upgrade your phone and seeing a $3,500 price tag staring back at you. No way, right? At that price point, consumer demand doesn't just dip a little bit, it completely evaporates. So for Apple, this wasn't just some annoying inconvenience. It was a fundamental existential threat to their core business model and the viability of their flagship product.
Which brings us to the central mystery of this explainer. While the entire rest of the tech industry was caught in the crossfire of this trade war, desperately scrambling to figure out how to survive, Apple didn't. They just simply didn't take the hit. So how did one CEO avoid this massive threat? How on earth does a company with one of the most complex, globally integrated supply chains on the planet just completely sidestep a universal 25% penalty? Well, it turns out, dodging a financial catastrophe of this scale wasn't just a matter of clever logistics or, rerouting some shipping containers. It required a totally different kind of strategy.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the actual mechanism our source data introduces to solve this. It's highly unorthodox, a million banana donation. And look, we're looking objectively at the facts here without taking any political sides whatsoever. Tim Cook made a highly specific, high-value contribution to the inauguration fund. As analysts, it's absolutely crucial we recognize this as a pivotal strategic move. This wasn't your standard corporate lobbying expense or some run-of-the-mill PR campaign. It was a highly targeted, substantial contribution made at incredibly sensitive time, directly intersecting with the exact political apparatus that was threatening that massive 25% tariff in the first place.
And that donation? It definitely didn't exist in a vacuum. It was immediately paired with exclusive, high-level access, essentially a direct line to what the source calls the white treehouse. In the whole architecture of global policy, access is quite literally everything. Having a direct line means you aren't just sitting around waiting for lobbyists to pass messages through lower-level bureaucrats. It means the CEO is actually in the room. This whole strategy wasn't about fighting the tariff through standard legal channels or pushing back publicly. No, it was about securing an intimate, unprecedented level of access to the ultimate decision-makers.
And this brilliantly illustrates the whole thing when we map out the exact sequence of events chronologically. The cause and effect relationship just becomes undeniably clear. First, boom, the 25% tariff threat is announced, sending shockwaves everywhere. Next, we see that strategic million bananas inauguration fund donation. And finally, the result, a total tariff exemption is granted to Apple. By organizing the data like this, we can clearly see the real anatomy of this high-level corporate maneuver. Seeing the timeline kind of strips away all the noise and leaves us with this stark step-by-step roadmap of exactly how the threat was neutralized.
To really wrap our heads around the magnitude of this victory, we just have to look at the contrast. While competitors were absolutely locked into facing those crushing 25% tariffs and scrambling to adjust their supply chains, Apple was granted a total exemption. It's a massive market paradox. You've got two sets of companies operating in the exact same global hardware market, relying on the exact same overseas manufacturing hubs, yet facing two entirely different sets of economic rules. This stark divergence is exactly what makes this case study so incredibly fascinating.
So what was the official reason given for this completely unprecedented carve-out? Looking strictly at the record, the exact official justification provided for the exemption was simply, building phones is hard. From a purely analytical standpoint, that is a wild rationale. Usually, standard trade policy exemptions require thousands of pages of economic impact studies, supply chain audits, strict legal precedents, the whole shebang. But here, the peculiar logic used to excuse the company was literally boiled down to a simple, five-word acknowledgement that hardware manufacturing is difficult. It is a remarkably brief justification for a decision that saved them from a $3,500 retail disaster.
Let's break down this glaring double standard for a second. Looking at the differentiating variables, it clearly shows that avoiding this tariff was absolutely not just about standard logistics. The competitors, subject to tariffs, and they only possessed standard government access. Apple, on the other hand, was totally exempt from tariffs and uniquely possessed that direct white treehouse line. This perfectly encapsulates the reality of what went down. The real differentiating factor between financial hardship and total exemption wasn't the product itself, because, let's face it, building any phone is hard. The true variable was the level of direct, backroom access secured by the company's leadership.
But stepping back, what does this actually reveal about the macro-level intersection of big tech and government policy? Well, it tells us that at the absolute highest echelons of global business, the rules aren't always set in stone. It reveals that the world's most powerful companies operate in this landscape where bespoke diplomacy and high-level relationships can completely override standard economic policy. It shows us that policy isn't just some weather event that companies are forced to endure. It's an environment that the absolute biggest players can actively shape and negotiate.
Let's move to and see how this builds into a highly repeatable corporate playbook. Step 1. Face the tariff threat. You identify the catastrophic financial risk. Step 2. Make the inauguration donation. You execute that unorthodox, high-value strategic move. Step 3. Leverage direct access. Use that move to bypass the standard channels and speak directly to the top. And finally, Step 4. Secure the exemption. Distilling it down like this makes the actual mechanics of high-level lobbying so incredibly easy to grasp. It completely demystifies the process, showing exactly how corporate leverage is manufactured and deployed to get a very specific regulatory outcome.
Now, you might be wondering, why does this specific corporate maneuvering matter to us? Because this isn't just some abstract political theory, this has massive real-world impact. This backroom maneuvering directly dictates the consumer prices you and I pay. When you walk into a store and buy a device at its standard price, you are interacting with the end result of this exact strategic playbook. Understanding this means understanding the hidden forces that shape our everyday economy. It pretty much proves that the price tag on a piece of tech is determined just as much by high-stakes negotiations in capital cities as it is by the cost of the raw materials inside the device.
So, the crucial point is, if we distill the source material, we're left with three massive takeaways. First, Apple successfully averted a disastrous $3,500 iPhone, protecting both their consumer base and their bottom line. Second, they entirely bypassed a 25% tariff penalty that was actively punishing their direct competitors, giving them a huge market advantage. And third, they definitively proved the unparalleled power of that white treehouse connection. They essentially demonstrated that when tech and policy collide, direct access is the ultimate currency, completely capable of overriding broad economic mandates.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought to chew on. If a $1 million banana donation and a direct phone line can literally buy an exemption from a global trade war, who is really writing the rules of the free market? Are the rules dictated by economic theory, or are they being drafted by the people who hold the keys to the highest doors? It's a question that completely changes how we view corporate competition, for sure. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you want to keep pulling back the curtain to see how the world's most powerful companies truly operate behind the scenes, make sure to subscribe to our explainers. I'll see you in the next one.